They had been waiting for a long time, longer than anyone could truly measure. On a distant world, far from the bright light of their sun, an entire civilization had devoted themselves to a single purpose: listening. Every generation, every mind, every machine worked toward one goal: the hope that somewhere, in the vast expanse of space, another intelligent life form might answer their call. And for centuries, they had been patient, because patience was not just a virtue here, it was a necessity. They knew that the universe did not operate on the timeline of any one species, and that great things often required decades, even centuries, of observation. In the quiet halls of their research stations, signals hummed and pulsed across enormous arrays of receivers. These halls were vast, echoing with the low murmur of machinery and the occasional voices of those who monitored the readings. The aliens, as they were often described by human minds that imagined them, moved with purpose and care. Every action was deliberate, every calculation precise. They did not rush, for they understood that rushing in the pursuit of knowledge often led to mistakes. Yet behind the calm exterior, a quiet excitement stirred, one that could not be hidden, even in the disciplined walls of their institutions. It was not just scientific curiosity that drove them, though it was a large part of it. They were explorers of the mind, lovers of the unknown, beings who had looked at the stars and asked themselves for millennia if they were truly alone. For them, a simple signal from another world was more than just a wave in the void. It was proof that life could transcend its own isolation, that the universe might hold more than just the story of one planet. They imagined the day when they would hear a reply, when another species would respond with thought, with culture, with a voice that could be recognized and understood. Every day without that response was a mixture of hope and quiet disappointment. But they never stopped listening. The methods they used were sophisticated beyond anything humans had imagined. Arrays of antennas stretched across landscapes, some stretching for miles, others floating in orbit above their planet. Every device was tuned to detect even the faintest whisper from light years away. Computers analyzed the incoming waves, separating the ordinary background noise of space from patterns that could indicate intelligence. Every pulse, every signal was scrutinized, measured, and cataloged. To the aliens, the universe was alive with potential messages, waiting patiently for understanding. And yet, the signals that came from one particular planet were strange. They did not arrive in neat, deliberate bursts like the aliens had expected from an intelligent civilization. Instead, they were chaotic, scattered, almost accidental. The patterns were inconsistent, sometimes strong, sometimes weak, sometimes fading into nothingness. The alien researchers debated endlessly over what they meant. Some argued that the planet was inhabited by a species just learning to communicate beyond its world, while others thought it might be nature itself, playing tricks with radio waves, storms, and magnetic fields. But the hope never faded. Even in uncertainty, there was anticipation. Over time, the waiting became a part of life for this civilization. Children grew up in the shadow of giant receivers, learning the hum of their machinery as a lullaby. Teachers spoke of the stars as teachers themselves, guiding lessons in mathematics, logic, and philosophy. Families discussed the possibility of life beyond their world over meals, not as a distant dream, but as a reality they were almost certain they would witness. The hope of hearing from humanity or whatever intelligence occupied that distant planet was woven into the very fabric of their culture. Every story told, every song sung, every book written contained echoes of that waiting, of that quiet expectation. Even the most skeptical among them could not entirely ignore the idea that one day something would arrive. Some questioned why they devoted their lives to listening to what might never speak, but even they were drawn into the rhythm of patience. It became a shared experience, one that unified them. For generations, they had learned that sometimes the act of waiting itself taught lessons no other experience could provide. It taught patience, discipline, humility, and hope all at once. It reminded them that intelligence was not just about what one could do, but also about what one could endure, silently and persistently. The anticipation affected more than their work. It shaped their emotions, their relationships, even their dreams. Some would dream of lights blinking in the distance, of messages traveling across the cold black void of space. They would wake with a flutter of excitement, only to return to their monitors and machines, hoping today might be the day when the universe finally spoke back. They did not speak much of these dreams to outsiders. To them, hope was sacred, and sharing it too casually risked diminishing its power. Instead, they carried it quietly, in the way people carry a fragile treasure, careful not to let it slip from their grasp. In the laboratories, the scientists worked with meticulous care. They would sit for hours, eyes fixed on displays, interpreting signals that were almost imperceptible. When a strange pattern appeared, alarms would not sound, but hearts would race. Every anomaly was investigated with patience and precision. Teams would gather, discussing theories, proposing experiments, and sometimes celebrating small victories when a signal seemed to match the intricate patterns they expected from an intelligent mind. These moments were rare, fleeting, but they fueled the relentless hope that had defined their society for generations. Outside the labs, the planet itself seemed to reflect their quiet determination. Vast cities glimmered under twin suns, a blend of technology and nature harmonized in ways that inspired visitors from other worlds. Even the architecture spoke of patience and purpose, designed to endure centuries, to support the work of generations who would never live to see the day their efforts might pay off. Every tower, every bridge, every observatory was a monument to the belief that the universe was alive with possibility, waiting to answer those who waited long enough to notice. Despite the sophistication of their machines, there was always the human, or rather sentient element. Machines could detect, measure, and calculate, but only minds could hope, wonder, and imagine. It was the combination of these two forces, the mechanical and the emotional, that defined their search. They understood that intelligence was more than data. It was curiosity, creativity, and the relentless drive to connect with something beyond oneself. And so, every day, they worked, monitored, calculated, and dreamed, knowing that one day a message might come, even if it was just a whisper from across the void. And then there was the quiet thrill of possibility that each day brought. Every dawn, every cycle of their planet offered a new chance. A new pattern could emerge, a new signal might arrive, a new answer might finally break the silence. And though many had learned to temper their expectations, the youngest among them never lost the fire of hope. They asked questions that older generations had long forgotten to ask, imagining conversations with beings they had never seen, with voices that might never speak. In their innocence, they carried the greatest hope of all, the hope that the universe was waiting to hear from them, just as they had waited to hear from others. Through all of this, the waiting became more than just an act of observation. It became a story in itself, a narrative of patience, hope, and unyielding curiosity. It taught them that the value of life could not always be measured in immediate results. Sometimes the greatest achievements lay not in discovery itself, but in the dedication to the search. They had waited for centuries, and though the future remained uncertain, they were united in a singular understanding. The silence was not emptiness, but a space filled with possibility, waiting for the right moment to speak. And they would wait, as they always had, because to wait was not passive, was the active expression of hope, the greatest message of all. For years, they had waited and listened, scanning the endless darkness for any sign of life beyond their world. Then, one day, faint signals began to appear from the distant planet they had long observed. The first signals were barely noticeable, just tiny blips in the vast stream of cosmic noise. Machines picked them up, and the scientists leaned closer, their eyes widening as the patterns became slightly clearer. It was as if the universe itself had whispered a secret, and for a moment, all their patient waiting seemed to be rewarded. Every mind in the observation halls focused on the tiny pulses, trying to understand, to interpret, to make sense of them. There was no doubt something was happening, though exactly what it meant remained a mystery dot at first. They were cautious. The signals were irregular and weak. Sometimes they disappeared for days, and sometimes they would return for a brief moment, only to fade again. The scientists debated endlessly, trying to determine whether these were true messages or merely natural phenomena. One group argued that it might be the rotation of the planet or solar storms interfering with radio waves. Another group insisted it was a deliberate attempt at communication, a faint voice struggling to be heard across the vastness of space. Every discovery brought more questions than answers, but the excitement was undeniable. For the first time in generations, the possibility of real contact felt tangible, almost within reach. As the signals became more frequent, the alien civilization threw themselves into analysis. Teams worked day and night, cross-referencing every pulse, every code, every irregularity. They developed new methods to filter out background noise, new algorithms to decode patterns, and new simulations to anticipate what the signals might represent. Every detail mattered: the timing between pulses, the strength of the signal, the subtle variations in frequency. Even the smallest anomaly was studied with care, because in their experience, small details often held the greatest significance. They approached the work with a mixture of scientific rigor and childlike wonder. Aware that history could be made with just one correct interpretation, the scientists imagined what kind of beings might be sending these signals. In their minds, they pictured creatures with curiosity, with creativity, and with a desire to connect. They imagined entire societies on the distant planet, struggling to send messages that could cross the immense distances of space. They considered the challenges of communication, the difficulties of sending a coherent signal without advanced technology. And with each imagined scenario, their excitement grew. The signals were not just patterns to decode, they were hints of life, evidence that another intelligent species might exist, reaching out in the only way it could. However, as the analysis continued, a surprising pattern emerged. The signals were not deliberate in the way the aliens had expected. They were inconsistent, scattered, and at times almost chaotic. Unlike the structured communications the aliens used among themselves, these signals lacked clarity, focus, or intentionality. They were, in a sense, accidental transmissions. Perhaps they were routine broadcasts. Perhaps they were mistakes. Or perhaps they were fragments of countless mundane activities on the distant planet. The alien scientists were baffled. How could a species so intelligent be sending signals that were so difficult to interpret? How could their attempts at contact be so indirect? Despite the uncertainty, the alien civilization refused to give up hope. They saw potential where others might have seen randomness. They began developing new frameworks for understanding the signals, treating them not as mistakes, but as a form of communication in a language they had not yet learned to recognize. Each blip, each pulse became a clue. Each irregularity suggested intention. They hypothesized that perhaps the beings on the distant planet did not communicate in structured codes like they did, but in patterns that were subtle, scattered, and woven into the fabric of everyday life. To understand these beings, they would need patience, imagination, and empathy. As they continued their work, the signals began to inspire more than just scientific curiosity. They sparked a sense of connection. The alien scientists felt a growing bond with the distant planet, even though they had never been there and would never likely set foot on its surface. They imagined the lives of the beings who might be sending these accidental messages, creatures learning, experimenting, failing, and trying again. They imagined the hopes and fears of an entire civilization that was oblivious to the attention it received across the stars. In a way, the signals became a bridge, linking two worlds separated by light years of space, yet connected by the fragile threads of curiosity and hope, as months turned into years. The alien civilization developed an almost ritualistic devotion to monitoring the signals. Every day, teams would gather to discuss new patterns, share observations, and propose theories. They would spend hours reviewing old transmissions, looking for patterns that might have been missed. They trained young scientists in the art of patience, teaching them not just the technical skills needed to decode signals, but also the empathy required to understand a species so different from their own. It became a culture in itself, a shared experience that defined their society. To wait, to observe, and to imagine was no longer just science. It was a way of life. At times, the signals would lead to celebrations. A new blip, slightly stronger than before, would spark excitement across the observation halls. Scientists would discuss the possible meanings, imagining the distant beings actively trying to reach out. Children in schools would hear stories of the signals, learning about patience, curiosity, and the joy of discovery. The entire civilization seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the distant planet itself had become a living presence in their minds. They celebrated the smallest successes, knowing that even a tiny clue could be the first step toward understanding something truly remarkable. Yet, with every celebration came frustration. The signals were fleeting, inconsistent, and often indecipherable. Entire theories were built on one promising pattern, only to be disproved by the next transmission. The alien scientists faced moments of doubt, wondering whether their patience would ever be rewarded, whether the distant planet would ever speak in a way they could truly understand. But even in doubt, they continued. The hope of connection, the dream of discovering another intelligent civilization, was too powerful to abandon. They had waited too long, invested too much, and imagined too vividly to turn away now. The signals also led to philosophical debates among the scientists. What did it mean to communicate? Was deliberate intent necessary? Or could accidental patterns carry meaning? Could intelligence be recognized through randomness? Or was it defined by the ability to organize thoughts and ideas? These questions challenged their understanding of life itself. They began to realize that their assumptions about communication were shaped by their own civilization, and that other forms of intelligence might operate in ways they could not immediately recognize. The signals were not just information, they were lessons, teaching them humility, patience, and the limits of expectation. As the years passed, the signals became a central part of their culture. Writers wrote stories inspired by the mysterious pulses. Artists painted interpretations of the signals, imagining the distant world that sent them. Musicians composed melodies based on the rhythm of the transmissions, creating works that celebrated both the unknown and the anticipation it inspired. Even the public, those who were not scientists, followed the signals with fascination. The idea that another civilization might exist, even if it communicated in strange and imperfect ways, captured their collective imagination. They began to see the distant planet as a companion in the vast loneliness of space, a reminder that life could exist in forms both familiar and entirely alien. Through all of this, the alien civilization learned to balance hope with patience, excitement with discipline. They celebrated the signals when they appeared, analyzed them when they were mysterious, and waited when they disappeared. They understood that communication, especially across the vast distances of space, was rarely simple. And though they did not yet fully understand the beings sending the signals, they recognized a fundamental truth. Intelligence could exist in many forms, and reaching across the void might require not just skill, but imagination and empathy. The signals, however imperfect, were proof that they were not alone, and that their long wait was not in vain. Every signal, no matter how small or confusing, carried a story. The alien civilization imagined the lives behind each pulse, creatures waking to a new day, experimenting, failing, trying again. They imagined hopes and fears encoded in the simplest bursts of energy, dreams reaching across the universe. And as they waited, studied, and imagined, they began to understand a profound truth. The journey to understanding another civilization was as valuable as the answer itself. Every blip, every wave, every faint whisper in the darkness was a connection. A reminder that even across unimaginable distances, life could find ways to touch life, and hope could thrive even in the quietest moments. As the years passed, the signals from the distant planet became more than just a scientific curiosity. They became a part of the lives of the alien civilization, shaping the way they thought, the way they planned, and the way they dreamed. Every new generation grew up with the story of the signals, learning to see the universe not just as a place to explore, but as a place that might respond in small, unexpected ways to their efforts. Children in classrooms would sit for hours listening to the patterns, imagining who might be sending them, imagining what life could be like on the distant planet. To them, the signals were proof that the universe was alive with possibility, a reminder that connection could exist even across unimaginable distances. The anticipation among the scientists grew with each passing cycle of their planet. They developed models, predicting what the next signal might look like, what patterns might emerge, and even what intentions might lie behind them. Every theory was discussed, debated, and tested, and every new generation of researchers built on the work of those who came before. It became a tradition, a legacy of hope and curiosity. To them, each signal was a question, each pattern a hint, and the possibility of an answer was a dream worth pursuing. Their world revolved around the idea that one day they might finally hear a voice from the stars, and that voice would change everything. The excitement was not limited to the scientists. Leaders and citizens alike were drawn into the mystery of the signals. Public discussions, debates, and even celebrations were held whenever a particularly unusual pattern appeared. Newspapers and media outlets shared updates, though they could not fully explain the technical details. The entire civilization became united in their fascination with the distant planet, even though no one had ever visited it and no one had ever spoken to it directly. The signals had become a bridge, connecting minds across light years, creating a shared hope that transcended everyday life. At the same time, the irregularity of the signals presented a challenge. They were not predictable, and they were not easy to interpret. Sometimes, the patterns seemed almost random, leaving the scientists puzzled and frustrated. Hours of analysis could result in nothing, and weeks of anticipation might end with silence. The inconsistency tested their patience, but it also strengthened it. They learned to wait without expectation, to study without bias, and to imagine without certainty. In this process, they discovered that true understanding required both intellect and empathy. To interpret the signals, they had to imagine life on a world they had never seen, to consider the perspectives of beings who may communicate in ways entirely unlike their own. The debates among the scientists grew richer and more thoughtful as they considered the implications of the signals. Were they truly intentional, or were they merely echoes of ordinary activity on the distant planet? Could life be intelligent without trying to communicate in ways they recognized? These questions pushed their understanding of intelligence and communication to new levels. They began to see that life could exist in forms and patterns they had never considered. Each signal, whether coherent or chaotic, offered insight into the possibilities of existence beyond their own world. The study of the signals became as much a philosophical pursuit as a scientific one, blending curiosity with imagination, reason with empathy. As they continued their work, the civilization also learned to celebrate the process itself. Waiting, listening, interpreting, and imagining became a culture. The act of observing the signals was just as important as any eventual understanding. Festivals and events honored the quest for knowledge, the patience it required, and the joy of possibility. Art, music, and literature flourished, inspired by the rhythms and patterns of the signals. People created stories about the distant planet, imagining societies, histories, and dreams of the beings who might live there. In every creation, the signals became a symbol of hope, curiosity, and connection, reminding everyone that even in a vast and silent universe, life might still reach out to life. The signals also changed the way the civilization saw itself. They realized that their assumptions about communication and intelligence were limited by their own experiences and culture. The distant planet challenged them to think beyond their own ways of understanding, to embrace the unknown, and to recognize that life could be diverse, complex, and surprising. They learned humility, understanding that their expectations might not always align with reality. The signals taught them patience, showing that even the smallest hints could contain profound meaning. And they learned hope, understanding that the search itself could be a source of joy and purpose, even without immediate answers. Families grew up with the signals as part of their daily lives. Children would ask questions about the distant planet, and parents would answer as best they could, often using imagination and stories to explain what might be happening. Teachers would encourage students to think critically, to analyze patterns, and to consider the broader implications of the signals. The civilization, as a whole, began to see the search for communication not just as a scientific endeavor, but as a shared human experience, a reflection of their curiosity, creativity, and desire for connection. The signals became a mirror, showing them the values, strengths, and imagination of their own species. Even the skeptics, those who doubted the importance of the signals, were drawn into the discussion. They questioned assumptions, challenged interpretations, and pushed the scientists to be more precise and thoughtful. In doing so, they helped strengthen the research, ensuring that every conclusion was carefully considered. Debate and discussion became a central part of their culture, showing that curiosity and critical thinking could coexist with hope and imagination. The civilization learned to value both skepticism and optimism, understanding that progress often required a balance between the two. With time, the signals inspired new technologies and innovations. The need to detect faint transmissions led to improvements in sensors, communication systems, and analytical tools. Every challenge presented by the signals pushed the civilization to be more creative, more precise, and more resilient. The signals became a catalyst for growth, not just in understanding the distant planet, but in understanding themselves. They realized that the quest for connection could drive innovation, strengthen culture, and unify society, even in the face of uncertainty. The anticipation also shaped personal lives. Many individuals chose careers and paths based on the signals, dedicating themselves to understanding the distant planet. Some became researchers, engineers, or communicators. Others became artists, philosophers, or storytellers, inspired by the possibility of life beyond their world. Relationships were influenced by the shared fascination, with communities forming around the hope of connection. Even everyday conversations often returned to the signals, with people speculating, imagining, and sharing their thoughts. The distant planet, once unknown and abstract, had become a presence in their daily lives, shaping their culture and identity in subtle, profound ways. As the years continued to pass, the civilization began to realize that the signals might never be fully understood in the way they had imagined. The beings on the distant planet communicated differently, perhaps in ways too subtle, too scattered, or too indirect for immediate comprehension. Yet even in this uncertainty, the value of the signals became clear. They were not just messages. They were a reminder that life existed beyond their world, that intelligence could take many forms, and that connection might appear in unexpected ways. The pursuit of understanding, rather than the certainty of understanding, became the true reward. The civilization embraced the signals as a reflection of hope, curiosity, and persistence. They learned that the act of waiting, observing, and imagining was itself a form of communication, a silent dialogue between worlds. Every pulse, every blip, every fleeting pattern in the darkness was a testament to the possibility of connection, a sign that life, in all its diversity, could find ways to reach across the void. And as they continued their patient work, they came to understand that the journey was as important as the destination, that the signals, no matter how imperfect or inconsistent, carried with them the most profound lesson of all, that life, wherever it exists, seeks to be heard, noticed, and understood. Years had passed, and the alien civilization's anticipation had grown into a deep part of their lives. They had spent generations listening, decoding, and imagining, and yet the signals from the distant planet remained strange, irregular, and often frustratingly inconsistent. Sometimes the transmissions would appear strong and clear, almost like an intentional greeting, and other times they would fade into nothing, leaving silence where expectation had once existed. The irregularity created a mixture of excitement and anxiety that the scientists and citizens felt in equal measure. Every new pattern brought a spark of hope, but every silence reminded them of the vast distance between the worlds and the difficulty of understanding another. Civilization dot as the scientists continued their work. Their initial excitement began to be tempered by a new emotion, doubt. They had imagined that intelligent life would communicate in ways familiar to them, using structure, clarity, and repetition. They had expected answers, conversations, even the possibility of cultural exchange. Yet, despite years of observation, the messages remained fragmented and chaotic. The more they tried to force understanding according to their own rules, the more it eluded them. Doubt crept into their discussions, causing heated debates and endless reconsideration of their models. Were they misinterpreting the signals? Were they imagining intelligence where there was none? These questions haunted the researchers, challenging both their patience and their assumptions. Even as doubt grew, hope persisted. The alien civilization had learned to hold both emotions at once, hope and uncertainty, balancing their anticipation with careful skepticism. They continued to analyze every signal, looking for hidden patterns, for clues that might indicate purpose. The scientists developed new technologies to filter out noise, new algorithms to detect even the faintest signals, and new simulations to predict how communication might occur across such vast distances. Every advancement brought them closer to understanding, yet the signals remained elusive, reminding them that intelligence could exist in forms that were unfamiliar and surprising. The irregularity of the signals had a profound impact on society as a whole. People debated endlessly about their meaning, their significance, and their origin. Philosophers pondered the nature of communication, wondering whether intention was required for a signal to carry meaning. Writers and artists created works inspired by the signals, portraying the mysterious world on the other side of space and the beings who might inhabit it. Even ordinary citizens found themselves reflecting on the signals in their daily lives, imagining stories, possibilities, and scenarios. The distant planet had become more than a point in the sky. It had become a symbol of curiosity, persistence, and the unknown. At times, the unpredictability of the signals caused frustration. Weeks could pass without a single pattern worthy of study. Months could go by with silence dominating the vast emptiness of space. The scientists felt the pressure of generations who had dedicated their lives to the search. They questioned whether the pursuit was worth the effort, whether their patience would ever be rewarded. Yet even in these moments of despair, the smallest blip, the faintest transmission, reignited their determination. Each signal, no matter how weak or chaotic, was proof that they were not alone, that life beyond their world existed, and that connection, however indirect, was possible. The alien civilization also began to reconsider the way they defined intelligence and communication. They realized that their own cultural assumptions had shaped their expectations. Just because the signals did not conform to the patterns they understood did not mean the beings on the distant planet were not intelligent. Perhaps communication for them was subtle, scattered, or even accidental. Perhaps it was not meant to be direct, but still carried meaning to those who listened carefully. This understanding challenged their perception of life, showing them that intelligence could manifest in ways they had never imagined, and that understanding might require empathy, creativity, and patience beyond conventional measures. As they adjusted their approach, the alien scientists also began to observe the broader context of the signals. They studied the environment of the distant planet, analyzing its broadcasts, its energy patterns, and even the faint traces of activity in its atmosphere. They searched for signs of life that might explain the irregularity, natural phenomena, technological interference, or societal behaviors that could create the scattered transmissions. They realized that understanding required more than just decoding signals. It required imagining a civilization, considering its challenges, and predicting its actions. In this way, the signals became a mirror, reflecting not just the distant planet, but also the nature of observation, interpretation, and understanding itself. The patience required to study the signals shaped the alien civilization in unexpected ways. They learned discipline, as days and weeks of analysis often led to minimal results. They learned resilience, as every failed hypothesis demanded new strategies and renewed effort. They learned imagination, as every irregular pattern required creative thinking to interpret. And most importantly, they learned humility, recognizing that even the most advanced civilization could struggle to understand another form of intelligent life. The signals, chaotic and inconsistent as they were, became teachers, guiding the society not just in science, but in philosophy, culture, and ethics. Despite the challenges, the signals inspired moments of joy and excitement. A single strong pulse could cause celebrations across research stations and cities, sparking debates, stories, and speculation. People would gather to witness the anomaly, to imagine the beings behind it, and to dream of the day when understanding might finally be possible. Even small successes, like identifying a pattern or predicting the timing of a transmission, brought a sense of accomplishment and hope. The civilization had learned to appreciate the journey, valuing the act of waiting, observing, and imagining as much as the possibility of receiving a coherent message. The unpredictability of the signals also led to collaboration and community. Teams of scientists worked together, sharing insights, testing ideas, and building on each other's discoveries. Discussions extended beyond the research halls, involving philosophers, artists, and ordinary citizens in conversations about the nature of life and communication. The signals became a unifying force, connecting people through shared curiosity and hope. They reminded the civilization that even in the vast silence of space, life could reach across unimaginable distances, and that connection could exist even when comprehension seemed impossible. Over time, the alien civilization came to accept that complete understanding might never be achieved. The signals were a mystery, and their meaning might always be partially hidden. Yet this acceptance did not diminish their fascination or their hope. They realized that the pursuit itself was valuable, that the act of waiting, listening, and imagining enriched their society and strengthened their culture. They understood that connection might not always take the form they expected, and that life could communicate in ways subtle, scattered, or indirect. The signals had become more than information. They were a lesson in patience, humility, and the nature of intelligence itself. Families, schools, and communities continued to engage with the signals in everyday life. Children asked questions, adults speculated, and everyone shared stories inspired by the distant planet. The signals influenced art, music, literature, and philosophy, shaping the culture in ways both subtle and profound. The alien civilization had grown to see the signals not just as potential communication, but as a reflection of life, curiosity, and hope. Every pulse was a reminder that life existed beyond their world, and that the universe was far more complex and mysterious than they had ever imagined. The signals also fostered empathy and imagination. Scientists and citizens alike learned to consider perspectives far removed from their own experience. They imagined the lives of the beings sending the transmissions, their challenges, hopes, and dreams. They imagined a society that communicated in ways entirely different from their own, and in doing so, they expanded their understanding of life, intelligence, and connection. The irregularity of the signals, once a source of frustration, became a source of insight, teaching them that understanding required more than skill. It required imagination, empathy, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. Through all of this, the civilization realized a profound truth. The silence between signals was as meaningful as the signals themselves. It was in the pauses, the gaps, and the inconsistencies that the nature of communication revealed itself. Life, they understood, did not always speak in ways that were easy to comprehend, but that did not diminish its presence or significance. The distant planet, through its scattered and unpredictable transmissions, taught them patience, resilience, creativity, and hope. And as they continued to wait, to observe, and to imagine, they came to understand that the value of the signals lay not just in their content, but in the very act of listening and believing in the possibility of connection. The alien civilization had grown through this journey. They had become more thoughtful, more imaginative, and more connected to the idea of life beyond their world. They had learned that understanding another civilization required more After years of observation, analysis, and imagination, the alien civilization began to realize something extraordinary. They had been waiting for what they believed would be a deliberate message, a clear sign of communication, but what they encountered instead was silence in its most revealing form. It was not emptiness, nor was it neglect. The absence of an intentional response from the distant planet slowly became a message in itself. The more they studied the signals, the more they understood that intelligence did not always express itself in ways they expected, and that life could communicate without ever intending to speak directly. This realization changed everything for the civilization that had spent generations listening and hoping. For the first time, the scientists and observers took a step back from their relentless analysis and began to look at the signals from a different perspective. They understood that the scattered, irregular transmissions were not failures. They were evidence of life, proof that a civilization existed and was thriving in ways entirely unrecognized by those who listened. It was as if the distant planet was saying, "We exist, and our life speaks through the patterns of our existence, whether you understand them or not." This revelation was humbling. The alien civilization realized that they had been seeking a kind of communication that mirrored their own culture, rather than appreciating the reality of another species, living, learning, and growing in its own way. As they came to grips with this truth, the alien scientists felt a deep sense of respect for the distant planet. They imagined the lives of its inhabitants, creatures going about their daily routines, building communities, exploring, creating, and facing challenges unique to their world. These beings might not have been consciously sending messages into space, but their existence, their patterns, and even their mistakes carried information about who they were. The alien civilization saw the beauty in this subtlety, the elegance of intelligence expressed without intention. They realized that life itself was a form of communication, and that every action, no matter how small or chaotic, was a part of the story that reached across the stars. The realization also brought a profound sense of patience and humility. They understood that waiting for a direct answer was not a failure, but a lesson in perspective. Intelligence could manifest in countless ways, and expecting it to conform to familiar structures limited their understanding. The silence between the signals was not a void. It was a space filled with potential, a canvas on which imagination and interpretation could flourish. They learned to listen not just with their instruments, but with their minds and hearts, appreciating the essence of life beyond the immediate need for clarity. This understanding transformed the civilization's approach to observation. They no longer sought only direct messages, but also signs of life, culture, and creativity in all its forms. They studied energy patterns, environmental changes, and technological activity, seeking clues about the civilization that lived on the distant planet. Every anomaly, every unexpected fluctuation, was now seen as part of a larger, intricate communication system that they were only beginning to perceive. The scientists realized that the challenge was not to force understanding, but to expand their own ways of thinking, to adapt to the unfamiliar rhythms and patterns of another intelligent species. As they embraced this new perspective, the alien civilization also began to reflect on themselves. They recognized that their impatience and expectations had been shaped by their own experiences, by the ways their society communicated and interacted. The distant planet taught them that intelligence and communication could be subtle, indirect, and even accidental, yet still carry profound meaning. They saw parallels in their own lives, realizing that understanding others required empathy, imagination, and the willingness to accept difference. The silent response from humanity, or whatever intelligence occupied that distant world, became a mirror for their own growth, showing them the limitations of assumptions and the power of perspective. In daily life, this realization influenced culture, education, and social interaction. Schools began teaching students not just to analyze and interpret, but to imagine, empathize, and appreciate complexity. Philosophers debated the nature of communication and intelligence, using the distant planet as an example of life that expressed itself in unexpected ways. Artists and writers found inspiration in the silence, creating works that explored subtlety, mystery, and the beauty of indirect connection. Families discussed the signals around meals and during quiet evenings, reflecting on the lessons learned from patience and observation. The distant planet had become a teacher, offering insights far beyond the realm of science alone. The alien civilization also found joy in the discovery. They celebrated the existence of life beyond their world, even without direct communication. The knowledge that another intelligent species existed, navigating its own challenges, solving its own problems, and living its own story, brought a sense of connection across the cosmos. They realized that understanding did not always require words, and that the very act of recognizing life, of observing, imagining, and interpreting, was itself a profound connection. Silence, once a source of frustration, became a bridge between civilizations, teaching lessons in empathy, patience, and respect. This perspective also reshaped their scientific priorities. Research expanded beyond the search for messages into the study of life in all its forms. They examined patterns of planetary activity, ecological development, and technological evolution, seeking insight into the civilization behind the transmissions. Every discovery, no matter how small, was celebrated as part of a larger understanding. They realized that life communicated through existence, through action, and through presence, even when deliberate messages were absent. Each blip, each anomaly, each irregular pattern was a story, a piece of information, and a testament to the persistence and creativity of intelligent life. The impact on society was profound. Citizens felt a deep sense of connection to the distant planet, a bond created not through conversation, but through recognition and imagination. They saw themselves as part of a larger universe, united by the shared experience of existence and observation. Communities formed around the study and appreciation of the signals, fostering collaboration, discussion, and creativity. Children grew up learning that communication could take many forms, that intelligence was not always visible or direct, and that connection often required patience, imagination, and empathy. The civilization had learned to value subtlety, to honor silence, and to respect the unknown. Over time, the alien civilization also reflected on the nature of expectation. They realized that waiting for a specific type of response had limited their understanding. The distant planet had not failed to communicate. It had communicated in its own way, through patterns, presence, and the act of existing. This revelation transformed their approach to other forms of observation, teaching them to be flexible, patient, and open-minded. They saw the value in every small signal, every irregular pattern, every hint of life, understanding that communication is not always a direct conversation, but can be found in subtle signs, ongoing activity, and the persistence of being. The scientists, in particular, found a renewed sense of purpose. They no longer sought perfection in the signals, but rather meaning in their imperfection. They studied every blip, every fluctuation, and every anomaly with care, recognizing that each contained insight about the distant civilization. They developed new methods of analysis, not just technical, but interpretive, blending logic with imagination and measurement with empathy. Their work became less about finding a single answer and more about understanding the diversity of intelligence, the complexity of communication, and the beauty of life expressed in unexpected ways. Finally, the alien civilization came to understand that the silence they had anticipated was itself profound. It was a response without words, a message without structure, a conversation without dialogue. It taught them that life could speak in ways that transcended expectation, that intelligence could express itself in patterns, presence, and persistence. They realized that the distant planet had always been communicating, not in ways they immediately recognized, but in ways that mattered deeply to those who learned to listen, to observe, and to imagine. The silence became a source of wisdom, a reminder of the power of patience, empathy, and understanding. In embracing this truth, the civilization found peace. They continued to monitor the distant planet, to study its patterns, and to imagine its inhabitants. But they did so with a new sense of respect and insight. They no longer demanded direct communication, no longer expected clarity on a human or alien timetable. They had learned that connection could be subtle, that understanding required imagination, and that life could reach across the void, even without speaking. The distant planet had given them a gift, the lesson that silence is not emptiness, but a form of response, and that sometimes understanding begins not with words, but with the patient act of listening and seeing the presence of life itself. Decades of patient observation and careful study had finally brought the alien civilization to a profound understanding. They had waited, analyzed, and imagined for countless cycles, searching for a message that would confirm the presence of another intelligent species. And yet, the answer they received was not in words, not in deliberate patterns, not in the kind of communication they had expected. It was in the silence, in the irregularity, in the very absence of a structured response. At first, this realization was difficult to accept. They had trained for a particular type of confirmation, a deliberate acknowledgement that they were not alone. But now they understood that intelligence did not always conform to expectation, and that life could communicate in ways both subtle and indirect. The scientists gathered in the observation halls, reflecting on what they had learned. For generations, their work had been guided by the hope of a clear signal, a direct conversation, a recognizable voice. And while that had not occurred, what they discovered was far more meaningful. The distant planet had communicated through its existence, through its patterns, through its daily rhythms. Life had been speaking to them all along, just not in the format they had imagined. This realization brought a quiet sense of awe. They were witnessing the universe itself, teaching them a lesson. That connection could exist even without intention. That understanding required imagination as much as observation. And that intelligence could express itself through persistence, presence, and subtlety. The civilization began to celebrate this new perspective. It was no longer a matter of waiting for a message, but of appreciating life as it manifested across the cosmos. They studied the distant planet not to extract words, but to understand the patterns of existence, the rhythms of activity, the signs of growth and change. Every pulse, every fluctuation, every irregularity became part of a larger story. They began to see that intelligence was not only about deliberate action, but about adaptation, creativity, problem-solving, and persistence. Even without deliberate communication, the distant planet had conveyed its essence, and the alien civilization recognized it with reverence. People throughout society were deeply affected by this understanding. Children in schools were taught that communication could take many forms, and that life could express itself in ways beyond their immediate comprehension. Artists created works inspired by the silent responses of the distant planet, imagining civilizations that lived and thrived without ever speaking directly. Writers and philosophers reflected on the lessons of patience, observation, and empathy, exploring how understanding could arise from presence rather than dialogue. Families discussed the mystery around meals and evenings, finding joy and insight in the idea that life, even when silent, had much to teach. The distant planet had become a presence in their culture, shaping thought, imagination, and emotion. The realization also brought a profound sense of humility. The alien civilization understood that intelligence could not be measured solely by clarity of communication, nor could understanding be forced by expectation. Life had its own forms of expression, shaped by its environment, history, and challenges. By seeking to interpret the distant planet's signals without imposing their own assumptions, they had learned to expand their own perspectives, to embrace complexity, and to value subtlety. They recognized that the silence they had long awaited was not rejection or neglect, but a profound reflection of the way life exists, grows, and persists. It was a response in itself, a lesson in understanding without words. With this new appreciation, their approach to research evolved. Scientists no longer sought perfect patterns, but instead studied the context of the signals, the environmental changes, the energy flows, the movement of technology, and even the indirect evidence of culture and behavior. Every anomaly was considered a clue, every irregularity a piece of information about the distant civilization's life. They developed methods to interpret patterns in a more holistic way, blending observation with imagination, logic with empathy. The signals became a guide, not a direct conversation, teaching them that understanding could be built from patience, careful study, and an open mind. The civilization also embraced the beauty of indirect connection. They realized that being aware of another intelligent species, observing its patterns, and appreciating its existence was a profound form of engagement. They had spent generations waiting for a voice, but in the end, the silent responses had connected them across unimaginable distances. The alien civilization saw that life, even when not speaking deliberately, could touch the minds of others. Their perception of intelligence had grown richer, more inclusive, and more respectful. They had learned that understanding was not always about receiving answers, but about recognizing presence, persistence, and potential. The experience also strengthened societal bonds. Communities came together to discuss observations, share interpretations, and imagine life on the distant planet. Schools encouraged students to think critically and creatively, blending scientific rigor with imaginative exploration. Philosophers, artists, and ordinary citizens all contributed to a culture that valued empathy, patience, and curiosity. The distant planet became a shared story, a symbol of the richness of life, and the diversity of expression across the universe. In learning to understand life in its subtle forms, the civilization also learned to understand itself better, its strengths, its limitations, and its capacity for wonder. As the years continued, the alien civilization recognized that the lessons they had learned from the distant planet were universally applicable. Silence, irregularity, and indirect expression were not signs of failure. They were invitations to expand understanding, to appreciate difference, and to value the act of observation itself. They realized that the universe was filled with life expressing itself in countless ways, and that true connection required imagination, patience, and empathy. The signals from the distant planet had become a mirror, reflecting both the diversity of life and the richness of perception needed to appreciate it. The alien civilization understood that to be part of a universe filled with life meant to listen deeply, to think broadly, and to embrace the unknown. The scientists and citizens alike embraced this new understanding with a sense of fulfillment. Their patient work, their persistent observation, and their imaginative interpretation had yielded a reward far greater than a simple message. They had discovered a philosophy of life, a guide for understanding intelligence and communication, and a reflection of their own values. They had learned that life could reach across distances in ways that were subtle, complex, and beautiful, and that even silence could convey meaning. The distant planet, through its very existence and irregular patterns, had taught them lessons that no deliberate message could have conveyed. In daily life, this understanding influenced thought, behavior, and culture. People approached problems with greater patience and creativity, recognizing that solutions might not always be obvious or direct. Communities valued dialogue, imagination, and empathy, understanding that connection could be expressed in many ways. Education emphasized critical thinking and creative interpretation, helping young minds appreciate complexity and subtlety. Art, music, and literature flourished, inspired by the silent, indirect communication of the distant planet. Even the most ordinary moments became opportunities for reflection, wonder, and appreciation of the vast tapestry of life across the universe. Finally, the alien civilization realized that the waiting itself had been part of the lesson. Patience, observation, and imagination had shaped generations, instilling values that transcended science alone. They understood that intelligence was not only about action or words, but about understanding, perception, and empathy. They recognized that connection could exist even when explicit communication did not, and that life had many ways of expressing itself, many ways of being understood, and many ways of reaching across the void. The silence they had long awaited was not absence, but presence and invitation to see, to learn, and to appreciate the profound complexity of life. As they continued to observe the distant planet, they no longer sought a single answer or a definitive message. Instead, they watched with wonder, studied with care, and imagined with joy. They celebrated the subtle rhythms, the irregular patterns, and the quiet evidence of life. They had learned that communication is not always direct, intelligence is not always visible, and connection does not always require words. The distant planet had responded in its own way, and in doing so, it had changed the alien civilization forever. They had discovered the true meaning of patience, the value of empathy, and the power of imagination. They had learned that to wait, to watch, and to understand, even in silence, is itself a profound form of connection. And so, the alien civilization continued their vigil, not in expectation of a reply, but in appreciation of existence. Every blip, every anomaly, every irregular pattern was a reminder of life beyond their world and the possibilities it held. They had learned that even across unimaginable distances, life could speak through being, through persistence, and through subtle signs. The silence had been the answer all along, teaching them to listen, to imagine, and to understand. And in that understanding, they found a connection deep